The Newshour Special Edition.
Welcome back. As developments from Washington continue to escalate tensions in the region, President Donald Trump has announced that the United States will undertake a mission to determine the Strait of Hormuz and also restrict the passage until the waterway is secured. It raises fresh concerns, and in the latest Truth Social post, Trump said that the only unresolved issue in talks was Iran's nuclear program, which he claimed remains the central sticking point. Now, these remarks come amid the growing debate over the broader strategic intent of the policy shift, as questions are also being raised about regional priorities and the focus of international pressure in the Middle East. Joining us exclusively is the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation, Thomas Countryman. Thank you for joining us, Ambassador. Vice President J.D. Vance has said that the failure of the Islamabad talks is worse for Iran than for the United States. Does the breakdown of such a high-level dialogue actually suggest a broader setback for both countries and potentially for regional stability?
Certainly, all of us had hoped for greater success at these talks in Islamabad. If there is a quick return to military hostilities, that would certainly be a disaster. But I don't assume that is going to be the case. Negotiations between the U.S. and Iran are always difficult and take a long time to achieve any useful success. That's what we saw with the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, in 2015. So I am hopeful that both sides have the incentive to continue talking rather than to go back into conflict. It's a curious situation. Normally, I know from buying carpets in the Middle East that if one side, the buyer, walks away, then it doesn't mean the end of the negotiation. The problem here is that both sides believe that they are selling the carpets rather than buying. Both sides seem to believe that they have the upper hand in these negotiations and that the other side has to come around. So I think it will still be a long process. I hope that the talks are resumed rapidly.
Okay, what, according to you, were the main sticking points which led to the collapse of the truce talks?
Several major sticking points. And before I list all of them, I would simply note that perhaps the greatest difficulties come from the United States side. First, that the U.S. has twice before interrupted negotiations by going to a surprise attack with military force against Iran. And so the Iranians are understandably skeptical of whatever the United States says in these discussions. I hope that we're past that. The second obstacle from the United States side is that they don't have the right people there. They don't have anyone who is conversant in nuclear technology, in the history of Iran, in the history of Iranian-U.S. negotiations. These are amateurs trying to negotiate a complicated diplomatic agreement. But in terms of the topics that divide them, remember that the 2015 deal dealt with just one issue, and that is Iran's nuclear capabilities. It was criticized by President Trump, and he violated that agreement because it didn't solve all the problems at once between the United States and Iran. And he said he could make a better deal. Instead, without that deal, Iran advanced rapidly in its nuclear capabilities, leading to the current war. And so today, in addition to that one extremely difficult issue, the U.S. and Iran would like to address all the issues at once: sanctions, ballistic missile production, support by Iran to allies, non-state allies in the region, and an issue that was not an issue before Mr. Trump made it one, and that is the future of the Strait of Hormuz. So to think that you are going to address all of these in a comprehensive package certainly requires more than a day and a half of negotiation.
Okay. In fact, the negotiations went on for 21 hours, yes. But Ambassador, Vice President J.D. Vance also described the U.S. proposal as a final and best offer. Does this signal the end of diplomatic flexibility, or is there still room for any back-channel negotiations with Iran?
Well, Mr. Trump has a long history, both in real estate and as president, of making a final offer, of making an ultimatum, a non-negotiable demand. But we have a little acronym in the U.S. that has been demonstrated time again in the last year and a half. That is TACO, Trump always chickens out. You should never assume that a final offer from Donald Trump is the only possible thing that is on the table. If he chooses to walk away from diplomatic negotiations now, then I think that Trump has even more to lose than the Iranian regime.
Okay. And the Vice President has also said that the United States still hasn't seen a clear commitment from Iran that it will not pursue nuclear weapons. This is a gap that ultimately led to the collapse of the Islamabad talks. So from your perspective, do you see any credible signs that Iran is willing to make such a commitment maybe in the future?
Well, those are two different issues. Iran has more than once made a commitment that it will not build nuclear weapons. It does that as a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It has done that in the JCPOA. It did that in the assassinated Supreme Leader's fatwa forbidding the development of nuclear weapons. So Iran has made that commitment several times over. What Mr. Vance was asking for was not just that commitment not to pursue nuclear weapons, but a commitment to never enrich uranium. And that is the point at which the U.S. and Iran have been stuck ever since Trump violated the 2015 agreement. So keep in mind there's a big difference between the capability to enrich uranium and the capability to build nuclear weapons. If the IAEA is able to strictly supervise the enrichment of uranium in Iran, it will be possible to enforce that Iranian commitment not to build nuclear weapons. What Vance is asking for is not a commitment to forswear nuclear weapons. It's a commitment not to do any enrichment. That's a very different thing, and that's the point that the Iranians have never conceded and are unlikely to concede today.
But now we've seen 5 weeks of intense U.S. and Israeli strikes. Iran is believed to have still retained much of its nuclear capability while also leveraging its position over the Strait of Hormuz. So given that J.D. Vance has said that talks collapsed over Iran's refusal to renounce the nuclear weapons ambitions, does this combination of the nuclear resilience and also economic leverage strengthen Tehran's negotiating hand now?
Well, the Iranians seem to think so. Now, I don't agree that Iran has significant nuclear capabilities at the moment. They have 400 kilograms plus of uranium enriched to 60%, which could serve as the basis of production of 90% enriched uranium, which would be suitable for construction of a nuclear weapon. But at the moment, because of U.S. bombings last year and this year, they do not have the same nuclear infrastructure, including advanced centrifuges, as far as we know, to rapidly enrich from 60% to 90%, let alone the capability to weaponize that material. So I don't agree that they retain significant nuclear capability. They retain the knowledge of what they have accomplished in their previous program, but they don't have at the moment significant capability to move forward. On the other hand, what you point out, having been handed by Mr. Trump's action control over the Strait of Hormuz, they have a significant weapon of chaos that they are willing to use to disrupt world energy supplies, cause inflation in the United States, cause increasing hardship more for the rest of the world, and particularly Asia, than they do for the United States. And I think the Iranians calculate that they have nothing to lose when they are fighting for the survival of their regime, and are willing to use that weapon of economic chaos against not just the United States, but against the rest of the world. So yes, they feel emboldened in the same way that Mr. Trump feels that all of the military strikes have given him the upper hand.
In fact, Donald Trump also appeared to be signaling a possible Trump card. He has spoken about, on social media, a naval blockade to choke Iran's oil exports if it refuses to comply. So do you see this as a strategic leverage to force concessions?
It is a move that Mr. Trump could make. It is not clear that it would be successful. Iran knows that closure of the strait also cuts off its own oil export capability. They have already taken that choice. For the United States to try to constrict further Iran's exports will not suddenly open up the exports from the rest of the Gulf producers. It would not solve the energy crisis. Iran has absorbed incredible economic losses, not just over the many years, but in this conflict. And to think that a chokehold on Iranian oil exports that would only marginally increase that economic loss for Iran, to think that that is going to cause them to capitulate is, I think, an incorrect calculation. It will only further disrupt world energy markets.
Okay. Admiral Brad Cooper has said that the United States has begun establishing a new safe passage in the Strait of Hormuz to ensure the free flow of commerce after reported mine laying by Iran. How do you assess the risk that such steps could escalate tensions into a broader confrontation with Iran? How do you see this proceeding?
U.S. naval capability is unmatched. However, it is far easier to attack an oil tanker than it is to defend an oil tanker. Even a tanker escorted by a U.S. Navy vessel is subject to attack, as well as the U.S. Navy vessel itself. And there are not enough U.S. Navy ships to escort every single tanker that wants to use the strait. So it's true that the U.S. Navy, with the help of other nations perhaps, could reduce the number of mines that Iran has placed in those waters, but it cannot defend against every possible missile, drone, or boat attack that Iran could launch. It's a worthwhile effort for the U.S. to try to clear the Strait of mines. That will have to be done before we get back to normality anyway. But it is not a guarantee that oil tankers can cross the strait without some risk of attack from Iran.
Okay, all right. Mr. Thomas Countryman, thank you so much for joining us on Times Now. With that, we're slipping into a short break here. We'll be right back.